2013. Firstly, on a scholarship from the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation, and then on a MEX scholarship awarded by the Japanese government. A graduate of the Slade School of Fine Art, UCL, the Royal Drawing School, London, and Tokyo University of Arts, Japan. Carl is the winner of the BP Travel Award at the National Portrait Gallery, the Sunday Times Watercolour Competition, the Nomura Art Prize Japan, as well as several other awards. His paintings have been featured on the BBC World Service and CNN and can be found in the collections of University College London Art Museum, Tokyo Geidai Art Museum, Japan, the Tokaido Hiroshige Museum in Shizuoka, and the Royal Collection being commissioned by Prince of Wales, as well as in private collections in the UK, Japan, Australia, and the USA. His BP Travel Award display of 17 Japan paintings at the National Portrait Gallery in 2013 was accompanied by Japan Portraits, a catalogue illustrating paintings and drawings made during his 10 years living in Tokyo. Carl is currently based in London, and please join me in
Thank you for that introduction, Kyoko. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming this evening, guys, whether you're joining online or here at Swedenborg House in London. As you may know, tonight I'll be talking about my Japan paintings and my time spent in Japan. The idea of an artist going to live abroad and make work about that country isn't a new one. There's a history and tradition of artists and creative people moving to another country and using the culture and people and society of that particular country as a starting point for a whole new series of work, whether they be painters, musicians, filmmakers, dancers, writers, etc. A couple of obvious art historical examples of painters who've done this include Eugene Delacroix, who made paintings of North Africa, and Paul Gauguin, who made paintings of Tahiti. A more contemporary example I'd prefer to give is the British artist David Hockney, who moved to California in the 1960s and made a whole series of paintings based on that place, which to a certain extent continues today. I'd like to open with a quote from Hockney, which very much sums up my feelings once I first arrived in Japan in 2013. I'd never been to Japan prior to that, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect, but I was very confident I'd find some very interesting subject matter for a potential new body of work, and that turned into a 10-year project. And also I hadn't really seen that done before, you know, a series of paintings based on Japan by a Western oil painter. So with that, let me read this quote out by Hockney. There were no paintings of Los Angeles. People then didn't even know what it looked like. I suddenly thought, my God, this place needs its Piranesi. Los Angeles could have a Piranesi, so here I am. Piranesi being the 18th century Italian artist who made etchings depicting Rome. Now, of course, it's not like in 2003, sorry, nobody knew what Japan looked like. There are thousands of travel photographers who've documented Japan through the decades. But again, I hadn't really seen a series of works by a Western painter documenting Japan. Cities such as London, Paris, and New York have been depicted many times by artists, providing subject matter for their work. Tokyo, I discovered, had never really been seriously painted before by a non-Japanese artist using the European techniques of oil painting. So I set myself the task of attempting to produce a series of artworks documenting Japanese culture and society as I saw it, with the aim of bringing them back to the UK to exhibit and promote, which is what I did. Before I show you the works, I'd like to read out one more quote, this time by the American writer Donald Ritchie. And Ritchie, he spent over 60 years in Japan. He wrote many books about Japanese culture, Japanese society, and the arts. And his writings, I don't know if you've read any, but they're very much influenced by the fact that he was non-Japanese and looking from the outside, kind of inside. I very much see my paintings in a similar way, really. I also had the good fortune of meeting and making his portrait. My interest in Japan is in a literal sense, of course, but in a sort of metaphorical sense, that I'm using the idea of the outsider, the foreigner, as my own vehicle as well. The outsider flourishes here because he knows he can't join in. So as I said, his writings are often from the standpoint or very much guided by the fact that he acknowledged that he's not Japanese and he's very much an outsider there. And again, that is how I see my own paintings also. With that said, I'd like to just, before I show you my paintings, I'd like to open with some introductory thoughts. These are aspects that I feel are important to my Japan work. When I'm showing you the paintings, I would ask you to consider or remember these points. This is the way I see my Japan work, irrespective of how other people see it. These paintings are views of Japan as seen through the eyes of a visiting European artist, through the lens of being an outsider. They're a marriage of different cultures, a British outlook combined with painting techniques rooted in a European tradition, which is oil painting, but applied to Japanese subject matter. So that's quite important. I wasn't going to Japan to learn sumi-e, like Japanese ink painting, or nihonga, Japanese painting, and then painting Japan. I was very much bringing my my Western upbringing and thinking with the techniques rooted in Europe and bringing it to Japan and applying it to Japanese subject matter. Given exactly the same subject matter, these paintings would likely look very different if painted by a Japanese artist. That's important. You know, I would have absolutely no idea how to paint Japan through Japanese eyes, but that wasn't my purpose. The sense of otherness is important, things that feel very different to and very separate from myself. Using painting as a form of documentation, trying to document Japan, not as it actually is, but as it felt and appeared to me whilst living there, whilst also trying to avoid making any direct statements or emphasizing any particular opinion or viewpoint. And it was important to me that I showed Japan of today, not emphasizing a Japan of the past. Even when showing traditional Japan, I did try to include something contemporary. These paintings are not idealized views of Japan. The idea was to create a varied document of Japan with emphasis on varied, things I really love about the place, but also occasionally less well-known and perhaps less celebrated or perhaps less desirable aspects. And lastly, it was necessary to spend an extended amount of time, it turned out to be 10 years, immersed in Japan in order to make this series of paintings, attempting to hopefully avoid any overly simplified, surface level or tourist level understandings of Japanese culture and society. With regard to that final comment, I do know of other artists that have went abroad for 1 or 2 weeks, taken a bunch of photographs and then returned to their studios and copied the photographs, and that's their response to another culture, which is fine. You know, artists can do whatever they like. It's not what I was trying to do. I have no interest in that sort of approach to a culture. And I think Japanese culture, I mean, all cultures really, but perhaps particularly Japanese culture being so layered and complex and subtle and nuanced and sensitive, I think it requires a certain level of dedication and a certain chunk of one's creative life to respond to it adequately. And I feel like those 10 years, these paintings wouldn't look the same if I had done that approach of just going there as a tourist. And, you know, I think perhaps one of the greatest compliments I've had about my Japan work is when I bumped into a Japanese man at the National Portrait Gallery when my work was being showed there. And he, as part of the BP Portrait Awards and this thing I was lucky enough to win called the BP Travel Award. And he said that before he saw the name on the wall, he thought the works were by a Japanese artist. Now, again, it's not like that. That's what I was trying to do, but I think hopefully that shows that the paintings have some level of understanding above and beyond a tourist or surface level understanding of the place. So those things said, let me show you the work. I've divided my work into 4 thematic sections. I feel that's more beneficial than showing you the work chronologically. And I'm not showing you all the work, just for the sake of time, I just selected works. The first is Urban Japan, depictions of crowded streets and spaces in Tokyo and scenes of everyday life. I was based in Tokyo for the vast majority of time, so most of my paintings are based on that place. This large 2.5 meter oil on canvas is called Shinjuku, and Shinjuku is an area in central Tokyo of the same name. Apparently Shinjuku train station is the busiest train station in the world. You can see that in the background there. In this painting, I was interested in showing the rivers of people flowing through the streets during rush hour, not just during rush hour, but at all times of day and night, set against the dramatic skyline of the city. This is a detail of that painting. And, you know, believe it or not, when I made this painting about 10 years ago, mobile phone culture hadn't quite spread worldwide, certainly not to the extent it is today. And I think Japan was one of the first places where mobile phones and smartphones were a very prominent part of daily visual landscape. So I'm happy that, you know, to a certain extent, this painting documents the birth of mobile phones. I mean, there's loads of mobile phones in different paintings now. This painting is called Tokyo, and it's based on similar themes. You know, the crowded streets, the rush hour. Tokyo is a very populated city, certainly more so than London. And again, here I was interested in the different faces set against the skyscrapers of an area called Tokyo, which is in Tokyo. This is a detail of that painting. All of these people came to the studio one by one and sat for me. I didn't use any photographs, but I'll talk about that later when I'm talking about a section about process. As well as these exterior scenes, street scenes in the city, I also did a series of interior paintings based on Tokyo. For me, I know for all artists it's different, but for me, you know, things I see or experience on a daily basis, they tend to feed their way into my work one way or another. You know, and I used to eat out a lot in Tokyo. I used to visit a lot of noodle bars, ramen bars, soba bars, okonomiyaki, sushi, whatever you have. So, you know, if I'm visiting noodle bars a lot, at some point, I'm going to want to respond to that. And this is based on different places I visited. It's not one specific place. It's a kind of amalgamation of different places, and trying to observe the different kinds of people I saw there, the food, the way they ate, details, etc. As I said, things that I kind of saw or experience on a daily basis. I mean, everyday scenes quite interest me. Feed their way into my work, and this is something I'd see every day. Anyone that's spent any significant amount of time in Tokyo will know that you inevitably spend a long time commuting on trains, and this is something I'd see. Again, trying to observe the kinds of people I saw, the things they were reading, etc. Similar to the previous painting, this is certainly something I'd see every day. Not trying to inject anything dramatic or surreal into the scene. It kind of is very much what it is. But even though this picture looks very realistic, it wasn't a snapshot of something I saw. You know, the advertisements are taken from different trains, and the buildings are taken from different parts of the city, and the different people sat for me. And so it's a kind of like an amalgamation of different things created to make a convincing scene, although it's kind of made up in a way. And again, trying to, you know, everyday observations such as what people do on the trains, you know, someone on a Game Boy there, someone on their phones, someone sleeping, and on the left there, a lady putting makeup on using a mirror, which is a fairly common thing you see on Tokyo trains, set against the concrete landscape of the city. This is a large pencil and ink drawing on paper. And most of the things I'm showing you are either oil paintings with some acrylic paintings, but this is a large drawing. This is called Shibuya, and it's based on an area of the same name in central Tokyo. And in this image, I tried to compress or or crystallize certain things I found interesting about Shibuya, rather than creating an exact depiction of it. So, you know, the kinds of people I saw there, the fashions, the street signs, the huge outdoor television screens towering over the small people walking below. I've already mentioned it a little bit, but many of these works are not exact transcriptions of how a place actually looks. They're often an amalgamation of different places and experiences, with an emphasis on recreating an atmosphere or feeling or communicating the idea of a place or thing. So as I said, they're a kind of compression or crystallization of things I found interesting about subject matter. You can see the photograph of Shibuya on the left there, and then there's my interpretation on the right. Often in my work, you know, the top of the hierarchy is for me trying to create a composition that I find interesting and that is strong, but also a composition that tries to compress or crystallize certain things I find interesting about a place or thing. You know, that has priority in my work, and even the iconic triangular pedestrian crossings of Shibuya, I discarded because it didn't work in my composition. So again, what I'm doing really is creating a subjective document. I still do see them as documents, even though they're quite subjective. And you know, if someone wants to know what Shibuya looks like, they can go there, or they can Google it. They don't need me or any other artist to tell them what Shibuya looks like. So that's that. This is called Roppongi nightclub, and Roppongi is a area in central Tokyo, well known for its nightlife and its bars and nightclubs. And this is based on different experiences in that area. It's not based on one particular nightclub. A mixture of Western and Japanese people, as one finds in that area. And there's Tokyo Tower in the distance, which is a landmark of Roppongi. Just a few studio shots to show you the scale of some of them. Some of them are quite large, others smaller. And some of these paintings, not all of them, were done at Tokyo Gaidai, which is Tokyo University of the Arts. And I spent about 6 or 7 years there doing my master and doctorate. Shopping malls, consumerism, capitalism, a big part of Tokyo and Japan in general. All of the images I've showed you so far, you know, rush hour, crowded streets, nightclubs, restaurants, commuters, and shopping. Even though these images are specifically of Tokyo, they're things you can find in any city all around the world, really. Which brings me on to the next section, and that is depictions of things more specific to modern Japanese culture, not as prevalent in the UK or other countries. So, you know, in a way, what would be the point of going to Japan to paint McDonald's or Starbucks, of which there are many in Japan? And, you know, in a sense, that would perhaps be an interesting thing to do. It would be saying something about something, you know, globalization or whatever. But the next few images are I feel, specific to modern urban Japanese culture. This is called pachinko. Let's get some water. And pachinko is a kind of cross between arcade machines and gambling, and they're everywhere in Japan, in the cities and countryside. And anyone that's ever visited a pachinko parlor or popped your head in the door will see something like this. I almost thought there was something sort of akin to factories about them. Everyone's sitting in the same direction, staring ahead, repeating the same physical mechanical activity, and lots of mechanical noises, and quite bright. And this is my representation of a pachinko parlor. Tetrapods are certainly not something we have in the UK. Tetrapods are large concrete structures, sometimes bigger than cars or the size of vans, and they line the coastline of Japan to stop coastal erosion. And there are millions of them in Japan, but I mean, after a few years of living there, you actually don't even notice them anymore. But I found them interesting enough to make a painting of. I found there's almost something quite sci-fi like about them. This painting, unsurprisingly, is called Sushi. Again, we have, you know, there's conveyor belt sushi all around the world now, but obviously it has its root in Japan. As I said earlier, I used to eat out a lot in Tokyo, so I This is a scene I'd see a lot, but again, not based on one specific place. It's an amalgamation of different places, observing the different kinds of sushi, the different color plates, and kinds of people I saw there. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, my aim was to create a varied document of Japan. I had no interest in going to Japan, making a bunch of paintings about geisha or cherry blossoms or quaint little temples in Kyoto. For me, that's not interesting. I'm not saying those things individually are not interesting. I just think if you're a Western painter and you're going somewhere as interesting as Japan, and those are the only things you focus on, for me, there's a sort of laziness to that. So again, this idea of creating a varied Japan, looking at kind of like the underbelly and counterculture in Japan. This is based on love hotels. Anyone that doesn't know what love hotels is, you can research it. And there are certain streets and areas in Tokyo that are designated to love hotels, lots of different designs, lots of different themes. And this is based on an area called Ugui-Sudani, and that's near Ueno in the east of the city where Tokyo Gate was my university. So I used to walk past this area a lot, and I'm trying to communicate a little bit of the atmosphere, and they have a certain kind of aesthetic to them, those areas. Similar to the previous painting, this is based on an area called Kabukicho in central Tokyo. And this Kabukicho is a well-known red light district, and even though there are red light districts all around the world, I found the ones in Tokyo, they just seemed that bit more visible and that bit more obvious, and you kind of know exactly when you're stepping into a red light district in Tokyo. And this painting tries to communicate a little bit of that atmosphere or the aesthetic that I found in those areas. The left panel also, hostess bars. I don't think that's something we have in the UK, and I think it seems quite specific to modern Japanese culture. The idea of going to a bar and paying to speak with women is something I found interesting about modern Japanese culture, and that's my response to Kabukicho. This next painting is a bit more subtle. It's based around or inspired by or has elements of salaryman culture, and paired with that kind of like housewife culture and marriage in Japan and gender roles. And there is a story behind this picture linking these four people, but it's a secret. I'm not going to tell you about that, and you don't need to know about that anyway. You can make up your own minds about the paintings. You may have noticed that this painting and the previous painting are triptychs. A triptych is three pieces of work, three paintings designed to be hung and seen together as one piece of work. I quite like the triptych format. It kind of offers various narrative possibilities, almost like three chapters from the same book or three scenes from the same movie or play. And the triptych has a long tradition in European painting. You can see some examples on the screen there. On the left, early Flemish painting, and on the right are new objectivity painters. I'm not just showing you these works for the sake of talking about triptychs. That's a more minor point. But I just to make a slight diversion about the idea of influences. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, I was very much bringing my own, British, Western, European background with me to Japan and applying that to Japanese subject matter. And I also brought, I'm much more steeped in a European tradition of painting than I am Japanese. So I think if I had to say for the sake of this presentation, I think I'm influenced more by Western painting than I am Japanese art. And again, there are probably, roughly, I love art from every art period in art history, really, but there are three groups of painters that I look at a lot and that possibly influenced me. One is the early Flemish painters, as you can see on the left, people like Jan van Eyck, Derek Bouts, Hans Memling, and there's a couple of rooms in the National Gallery that have a lot of paintings by those painters, and they're absolutely extraordinary. I think they were magicians, actually, in terms of what they could do with paint. Absolutely extraordinary. And also new objectivity painters of 1920s Germany. That's between the two world wars and during the Weimar Republic. Painters like Otto Dix, Max Beckmann, and then a third group, not so much a group, but more a period of time, early 20th century American and British painters such as Edward Hopper, Andrew Wyeth, Stanley Spencer, and Edward Burr, to name a few. So again, I think my influences are more Western in terms of picture making than Japan. I may talk about that a little bit later. Third section is depictions of more traditional Japanese culture, perhaps more rural than urban. All the things I've showed you so far are depictions of contemporary urban Japan. And anyone that is familiar with Japan will possibly know that, you know, old Japan and new Japan, they very much kind of rub shoulders together, and their neighbors. So even though the next few images are based on more traditional aspects of Japan, they are still about contemporary Japan. And as I said at the beginning of the presentation, even if I'm showing something quite traditional, it's still important for me to put at least one thing in there that places it within the modern world. This is based on a specific Zen garden in Kyoto, the old capital of Japan. Japanese gardens have a specific, incredibly beautiful aesthetic about them, very different from European gardens. And you have the cherry blossoms at the top. This could have looked like a scene from 200 years ago, you know, but again, I have no interest in showing a kind of idealized historical view of Japan. It's very important that the guy who sat for me for this, Takashi, I could have asked him to wear a kimono or yukata, you know, traditional Japanese clothing, but my choice of clothing, the Western clothing, it places it into modern Japan, and contemporary Western clothing is more visible in Japan anyway, more so than kimono or yukata. That was important to me. This painting is called Onsen, and it's hot springs are a big part of Japanese culture, both now and in the past. Japan being a volcanic island, it has thousands of natural hot springs, and it, you know, provides an opportunity to socialize with friends and work colleagues, and go for day trips to well-known hot springs in the countryside, which I did a few times. And this is a kind of amalgamation of different places. The title of this painting is The Rice Farmer's Daughters, and a short train ride outside any Japanese city, and you'll come across rice fields and rice farming, obviously a big part of modern and certainly traditional Japanese culture. I'll talk about this painting a little bit later when I'm talking about composition. The title of this is Fireflies. Even though this is a fairly common scene in the summer, you know, one does see fireflies dancing around the rice fields. You know, it's quite every day really, but in this painting, other paintings also, but perhaps particularly this one, I was trying to communicate or pick up on a little bit of that kind of slightly kind of magical feel you get in Japan, and which is very difficult to articulate into words. Anyone that's lived there or loves Japan will know what I mean. So this painting tries to communicate that kind of slightly kind of magical feeling that, you know, I found when you encounter certain aspects of Japan. In the autumn, the leaves of the trees turn red. This is called koyo, and this is celebrated part of the autumn. People go for day trips to see the red leaves, and there's certain areas in Japan that are famous for this. And you know, one of the many things I love about Japan is how the seasons are very distinct. You know exactly when it's spring, summer, autumn, and winter, and each of these seasons are celebrated with something. So in the spring you have the cherry blossoms, and the summer you have fireworks, and autumn this, and the winter ice festivals. And each season has a very distinct cuisine and food associated with it, and even each prefecture in Japan has its own specific cuisine and food. In the UK, sadly, we don't really celebrate the seasons as much, probably because we just got 2 seasons really, you know, 2 weeks of the summer, and then the rest of it is variations on the theme of winter. Sorry, this seems to be misbehaving. I'm going to go back a few. Where are we? Okay, yeah. Let me just skip this. No, we're not there yet. Okay, sorry about that. Sumo, a very specific Japanese sport. Again, this could have been a scene from a couple of 100 years ago, but placing those little mobile phones on the left side, it placed it into a contemporary setting. I did visit a few tournaments while I was there, and very exciting seeing these guys trying to throw each other out of the ring for those few seconds, a few minutes. It's quite thrilling. I'd recommend it if you haven't been to one. And then a few more generic scenes of rural Japan and the Japanese countryside. I lived in this village for 1 month in the north of Japan with my university department on a painting trip, and I sat on top of a building with my easel and I painted this scene in the hot baking summer sun, and a lady from the village sat for me, and that's her in the bottom left. Also, a group of local kids used to come and visit us and see what we're up to, and this is a portrait of them set against the mountains that surrounded the village. This is my homestay family whilst I was on the 1 month homestay with the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. If you're on the scholarship, you get to choose where you want to go for 1 month in Japan, and it seems to be a very popular part of the scholarship. I chose to go to Hiroshima Prefecture. I lived in that tiny little house in the distance, surrounded by rice fields for 1 month. This was my homestay family. They were rice farmers, and I helped them out a bit with the rice farming. It was quite fun. The fourth and final section is the old and new, traditional Japan alongside modern Japan. I mentioned it earlier, but this idea of, old and new Japan very much rubbing shoulders alongside each other. And I think this is something also tourists quickly pick up on when they first arrive, even something like as basic as a temple in front of a skyscraper, or someone wearing a kimono holding a mobile phone. But even after a few years of being there, these things are still interesting. These next few paintings, they're not about that, but they have elements of that in them. Kabuki, a traditional Japanese theatre. I went to a few presentations, pretty extraordinary. And this is on a large outdoor television screen. Large outdoor TV screens are very much part of the visual landscape of Tokyo. And you do see things like this occasionally, kind of like an image of modern Japan flashing up on these huge screens. And you get a sort of thrilling electric shock of the old and new Japan. And this is what inspired this painting. This painting is called Electric Tokyo. The Shinkansen, the bullet train, a symbol of modern Japan, and perhaps more so a couple of decades ago, set against Mount Fuji, which is a symbol of traditional Japan. Then you have the red torii gate there, and the mobile phones, as I talked about earlier. I've talked about the seasons a little bit. This is based on the spring. In the spring, for a couple of weeks only, the cherry blossom trees blossom, and everyone goes outside and sits under the trees and gets drunk with their work colleagues and friends. And this is a subject matter for a lot of traditional Japanese ink paintings and woodblock prints. And this is my depiction of that set against the skyscrapers of Tokyo. So far, I've mainly been talking about subject matter. Other than the things I asked you to consider at the beginning of the presentation, that list of things I asked you to consider when looking at my paintings, the way I see my paintings, I don't really have a great else to say about my Japan paintings. They kind of are what they are. I'm very much a representational painter. I'm not a conceptual artist. There's no kind of hidden ideas behind them. So to extend the presentation, I'll talk a little bit about process and this idea of painting people from life. Whenever you see faces in my painting, especially the large crowd paintings, they were done from life without use of photography. They each came to my studio one by one, and I'd kind of gradually fill up these huge canvases. I did a whole series of crowd paintings, and just for time, I'll try and bullet point it, but the reason I prefer working from life rather than photography where possible, number one, it's a technical issue for me. I find it easier to identify light and dark and shape when painting someone from life rather than a photograph. A photograph is an edited version of reality. It tends to flatten things. And if you have the real thing there with you, all the information's there, and I find it easier to, identify light and dark, but with that, create a sense of three dimensions. That's one reason. Another reason is, this is a large 2.5 meter canvas called Tokyo Portrait. and this required meeting and making the portraits of about 250 Japanese people who lived in the city. And this is, I see these crowd paintings within the genre of group portraiture that has a long history, obviously. And they're a document of a group of people that lived at a specific time at a specific point in a city's history. And here I'm trying to pick up on or examine the particular characteristics and peculiarities of each person's face. I didn't want to fall back into what I thought a Japanese face looked like. This is a detail of that painting. So I felt it was important to have the people there with me. Another reason is, when people sit for me, I know a couple of you are painters here tonight, but if you've ever painted someone's portrait or sat for a portrait, you do tend to move a little bit. People aren't statues. And I find that creates a very subtle distortion in the portraits that I almost find truer to life than copying a static photograph. So I quite enjoy that distortion that occurs when you work from life versus a photograph, for me anyway. Another reason painting from life rather than photographs is during the 10 years in Japan, I estimate that I probably painted, I think, well over 1,000 people. And it was a really good education for me to get to know the city and the culture. Getting to know a culture isn't just about, I don't know, you're going on holiday there, reading about it, or eating the food, or visiting temples. A lot of it is about getting to know the people. And through making this series of crowd portraits, I met a lot of people, and I got to know a lot of people from different ages, different jobs, different stratas of society. And I felt I got to know the city better through doing these crowd portraits. That was another reason. Also, just purely on an enjoyment level, it's a lot more enjoyable painting someone if they're sitting there with you versus staring at a small piece of paper with some chemicals arranged on it, which is that resembles the thing the camera was pointed at, which is essentially what a photograph is. There's no competition between the two as far as I'm concerned. If it is possible to work from life, that is. I don't consider myself to be a portrait painter as such, but I did, although I have had commissions, but they're always with quite a significant background. I'm more of a narrative painter who combines people and places. But I did do a few straightforward portraits whilst I was there. This is a couple of examples, 1.5 hours each. And these 8 separate pencil and ink drawings. These were the first pieces of work I made when I first arrived in Japan, just asking people to sit for me. And I also had the honor and privilege of being asked to be artists in residence in Hiroshima City to meet and make the portraits of hibakusha. Hibakusha are people who survived the atomic bomb. And I was invited by a Japanese lady, an art curator who organizes exhibitions in the city and asks artists to respond to the events of 1945. My project was inspired by a book called Hiroshima by an American journalist called John Hersey. He arrived in the city soon after the bomb was dropped and interviewed and documented the stories and experiences of 8 survivors. And my proposal was, it's almost like a visual equivalent, meeting and documenting 8 survivors through portrait drawing. These are pencil and ink drawings. And some of them were kind enough to invite me into their homes, and they'd make me a cup of tea, and afterwards they'd make me a lovely Japanese meal and I'd meet their family, and that was a great privilege for me. So yeah, straightforward portraiture, not something I often do with a neutral background, but these are examples of that. These are paintings, not drawings. This is called Hibakusha Triptych. And these were made in a retirement home in the city, specifically dedicated to hibakusha. Everyone who lived there survived the atomic bomb. You can see the photographs at the bottom of the slide there, me painting those portraits. I'd also like to talk a little bit about process. and the development of ideas. As I said, I used to eat out a lot in Tokyo, and I also used to keep a lot of sketchbooks. You know, when I was out and about, I used to keep tiny little sketchbooks with a pen, and I used to just sketch a lot, really. It's not like I made these drawings because I knew I wanted to make a painting of a noodle bar. It was possibly the other way around, where, you know, it's through doing these drawings, not with any aim or agenda other than sketching, that I think the idea for making a painting about a noodle bar germinated in my head. So once I decided I wanted to make a painting about that subject matter, I got people into the studio to do more prolonged poses, studying how they ate, use the chopsticks, etc. Then through a combination of these drawings and photography, I eventually arrived at this composition. Just to revert back to what I was talking about earlier, you know, the influence of, for example, the early Flemish painters. Perhaps you can see it here. It's almost got a slightly Last Supper kind of vibe to it. I mean, it isn't the Last Supper, it's a noodle bar in Tokyo, but you can see it there a little bit, the influence. I had only worked out the composition in line before I started the painting. I hadn't worked out my tonal values, where the light and dark will go. I usually do, but I was just impatient to start this painting. And that was to my detriment, as I'll show you in the next step. This is the next step on the canvas now. I painted someone's portrait in the bottom right. And he came to sit for me, and I painted his arm as well. Then I sat back and I thought to myself, well, in order for this composition to work, I think I'm really going to need a bright table against dark figures. So then I had to completely repaint him out. He couldn't come back and sit for me. So I painted someone else in dark and got the light table behind him, and that seemed to work better. And that's the next step. So just a tip for any art students, make sure you have your tonal values sorted out. Otherwise you can waste a bit of time like I did there. Anyway, the next step is this one. I painted the menu on the wall at the top. Which, you know, one does find in restaurants in Japan. You get the menus painted on the wall sometimes. And again, I stood back and I thought to myself, well, you know, I don't think this is as good as it could be, really. And I think I came to the conclusion that it was flatness against flatness, a deliberately flattened table, which I talk about later, against a flat wall, and it wasn't very dynamic. So what I then did was completely paint out that menu. With a nocturnal street scene. And then it seemed to work a lot better. You have the interior, exterior, and you have real space contrasted with flattened space. So it just seemed a lot more dynamic then. The Tokyo subway painting, similar kind of process. As I said, I used to keep a lot of sketchbooks when I was out and about and during my hours of commuting. I think I probably did easily over 1,000 of these tiny little drawings. Again, it's not like I was doing these drawings because I knew I wanted to make a painting about a subway. Again, possibly the other way around. It was through doing these drawings, again, with no aim or agenda other than just sketching, that the seed of an idea about making a painting about a subway germinated in my head. And then once I decided I wanted to make a painting of that, I came up with different compositional designs. These are clockwise. The top left is the first design. The top right, I felt was a bit too complicated. It's not a particularly strong composition. The bottom right was closest to what I wanted. So then I transferred in line onto a large canvas. I got people into the studio to sit for me and pose like this and paint their faces, etc. And then I painted the painting. Often my paintings start with very small, crude, quick little line drawings. These are called thumbnail sketches. A thumbnail sketch is often a physically very, very small drawing, usually in line, very crude, not trying to impress anyone with the academic level of drawing skill. When I did these sketches, I didn't know they would eventually become a large 2.5 meter ambitious oil painting. I actually did a couple of these sketches sitting in a cafe overlooking this train station and waiting to meet somebody, just to keep myself occupied, really, when I was waiting. It's only when I came back to them a couple of months later that I thought to myself, well, that would kind of make an interesting painting. And, you know, and also you can see one of my initial ideas was portrait format, vertical, and you can see the finished painting ended up as a landscape format, horizontal. So yeah, a lot of my paintings start with these very quick little drawings. you know, it's not like I intended to show anyone these drawings. And, you know, they're very important because it's trying to get the seed of the idea onto the page. You know, having an idea in your head for painting and then translating that onto a flat surface, they're two completely different animals, I find. And there's some sort of, I've never had an idea in my head yet that looked the same as when I then translated it onto a page. There seems to be some sort of mysterious gap between those two things that one is not in control of. And, you know, it's these sketches, they're just to visualize, you know, how interesting is it? Is it interesting? Is it not interesting? Will it make a good painting or not? And some of them go in the bin. And I'm just showing you the ones that eventually became paintings. Again, you can see that my initial idea there was portrait format, and then the finished painting was landscape format. This is a bit more of a worked drawing. It's not so much of a thumbnail sketch. The finished painting's on the right, and I think if I remember, I discarded the vertical idea because there wasn't enough emphasis on the machines, and then the square format seemed to emphasize the machines more, which is what I was after, really. I'd like to talk a little bit also about picture making in general, and I know for all artists it's different, you know, and I can see a couple of artist friends here this evening. But for me, you know, the motivation behind wanting to paint something in a very reductive sense, it's kind of twofold. One is the subject matter. To a certain extent, I'll be interested in the subject matter. But as well as that, completely separate from subject matter is the need for me to set myself a visual challenge or have a visual theme or idea that is separate from the subject matter. What I mean by that is the noodle bar on the left, we know what the subject matter is, but the visual challenge I set myself was to try to make work a deliberately flattened table against figures seen from the side. It's the same with the sumo painting. Try to make work, you know, a ring or stage as seen directly from above and contrasted with figures seen from the side. Not only that, but with this painting, trying to make work combining a black and white palette and a color palette, which I think I'd never done before this painting. The rice fields painting, the visual idea or theme I had was this kind of strong, repeated horizontal stripes, almost thinking of it as an abstract painting. Also, the contrast between the deliberately flattened space with the quite three-dimensionally modeled heads. I'll talk about that a little bit more soon. Repetition of shape and pattern is quite important in my compositions, not always, but quite often. As I showed you earlier, this isn't an exact transcription of Shibuya. It's almost like a composition started from scratch, really, and then fleshed out to recreate the feeling or appearance of Shibuya. And it was very complicated to come out with this composition. It took a long time. I find very good figurative painters or realistic painters, or however you want to term it, they're very good at, or they have an intuition for, or they have an understanding or a feel for the abstract elements that make up an image. What I mean by that is, you know, line, tone, pattern, color, etc. And how to manipulate those formal elements of a picture to show what they want to show. I could name a few painters that do that amazingly. Even though this image looks quite realistic, I was trying to think abstractly when I was putting it together. And you know what I mean by that is this idea of repeated circles. If you look at the girl's head in the top right on the large television screen, that is kind of an icon of Shibuya. She has a very rounded head. It is based on a real person, but her head wasn't as round as that in reality. I made it round in order to echo the round plate at the bottom. So that is to balance the top and bottom of the composition. And what I'm trying to do is create a cohesive design that gels together, and creating a visual language is important to me, rather than just illustrating something. That's a completely different talk now that could go on for an hour or so. Illustration versus fine art painting. But I think there's something in a very reductive sense. That means massive gray areas, but about creating visual language or thinking abstractly about an image. Fine art painting and illustration, perhaps less so, but that's not you know, I'm not stating that as it's not a statement. As well as the circles, repeated stripes. You know, a lot of people in the picture have stripy clothing. That's not coincidental. Those stripes are to echo the stripes of the pedestrian crossings and the buildings in the background. Again, trying to create a cohesive design that fits well and trying to create balance and trying to create a visual language to the picture. Similar with this one, it's not a coincidence that the umbrellas are stripy. Those stripes are to echo the stripes of the pedestrian crossings and the buildings at the top, and also the checkered pattern of the umbrella at the bottom. Those checkered are to echo the checkers at the top in the buildings, balancing the top and the bottom of the picture. I talked about this painting a little bit earlier with regard to, you know, the importance for me to not make it look like it's historical Japan and place it in today's Japan through the choice of the Western clothing rather than the kimono or yukata, traditional Japanese clothing. So that piece of clothing serves that purpose in terms of a narrative, on a narrative level, but it also serves, has a visual purpose. And the horizontal stripes of the clothing, they're echoed in the horizontal stripes of the stones in the Zen garden. You know, you get the monks some of the monks who are employed to rake the stones, and they create these really beautiful patterns with them. And those horizontal stripes are echoed in the choice of clothing with the horizontal stripes on the clothing. I talked about triptychs earlier, three paintings designed to be seen as one. This is a diptych, which also has a long history behind it. Two paintings to be designed to be seen together. The title of this is Hanabi Hanami, Hanabi meaning fireworks and Hanami meaning the viewing of cherry blossoms. We know what the subject matter is. It's the summer and spring. That's what the subject matter is for this piece of work. But as well as that, you know, as I said, it's important for me to have a visual theme or an idea as well as subject matter. And the thing I kind of hooked onto for this picture is this shape of a flower. The fireworks have like a flower shape to them, and then the shape of the cherry blossoms have a kind of flower shape to them, and that kind of that binds the two images together and kind of brings the left and right panel into the same visual language. And as well as that, just as a side note, I also quite enjoyed how in this picture, this idea of the flower is also echoed in the name of both of them. In the kanji, the Chinese characters, Hanabi, Hanami. Hana means flower, and that is present in both of the names of both of them. So I quite enjoyed how it worked on another level in terms of Hana being present as a shape, but also in the name of them. The distortion of form is also something I do in my paintings. Not so much recently with my London work, but some of these Japan paintings, I did this. As I said earlier, you know, the top of the pecking order for me, sometimes when I'm making paintings, is composition. I'm trying to create a composition that I find strong and interesting, with the aim of kind of compressing or condensing certain things I find interesting about that place or thing. The largest shape in this composition is a circle. You have a very dominant circle there. This painting had to have a portrait in it. I mean, I'm a portrait-based painter anyway, but it had to have a portrait in it because it was a project for the National Portrait Gallery. And with regard to trying to create a cohesive composition that works, that gels together well, what I did was distort the girl's head. It is based on a real person. I curved the face, and that is to sympathize with the circle, that large circle I showed you. You know, I hope you'll agree that just going back a few slides, works less well than that. That is a more cohesive design, I think. And again, design, composition is often at the top of my priority. So, you know, this idea of distortion with regard to creating a visual language, and also just this next image here, that is a doctored version of my painting to show you how her face looked like more in reality. She had a more rounded head, and but I think you can see that works less well than that. The next couple of paintings were commissioned, so it's not like I would have voluntarily painted Formula One. I probably wouldn't have, but I was sent there as artist in residence to make a series of paintings for an exhibition in London about Formula One. So when I was there, you know, there's lots of interesting things that I could have picked up on. And again, this idea of setting myself, having a visual idea as well as subject matter. The two things I picked up in the events were the shape of the cars, the Formula One cars, and also these events. I don't know if they do this in other events around the world, but in Japan, they employ girls called race queens. And I think these are basically fashion models that stand around the events. So those are the two things I tried to show in these series of paintings, as well as crowds, which is my thing anyway. And to try to create a balance to the picture and using repetition and distortion and creating a cohesive design. What I did was echo the long, slender necks of the Formula One cars in the long, slender necks of the girls, obviously distorting the necks, but again, creating that connection, trying to create a design that's cohesive and has a language to it rather than complete realism. Which brings me onto the next thing. I've talked about it a little bit so far, the idea of flattening space and connected with that pattern making. For me, if an image is too real, if the rendition of form is very real, and the representation of space and perspective and scale is very real, and the colors are very naturalistic, for me, that would be too real. It would be too close to a photograph. And for me, not that interesting. But what I try to do in some of my images is create a tension between the real and unreal. What I mean by that is I often try to paint form quite realistically and give it a sense of three dimensions. When I'm painting a color portrait, I often use an underpainting, either gray, grisaille, or green verdaccio. And these are old master techniques. And actually, the early Flemish painters who I mentioned earlier, they always used underpaintings. And this is with the aim of trying to make them look quite 3D. And that contrasts with the flattened space. You get this tension between the real and unreal. In the next image, I've doctored it to show you how space would behave in a more realistic sense, with things being large in the foreground and as they move away from us, becoming smaller. That's how the space would behave in a more realistic sense. But hopefully you'll agree that that is less interesting than that. And, you know, so what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to give the mind something to wonder about, or something to play with the eye, rather than putting everything on the plate and nothing to puzzle over, you know. And also this idea of flattening, it does then also emphasize pattern making, and I'm very much interested in patterns. So now that I've talked about this, if you look at the examples on the screen here, you can see I'm not really that interested in creating realistic images. You know, there's an emphasis on patterns and shapes, and the rice fields painting in the top left, it could have created a greater sense of depth and perspective quite easily, but I wasn't interested in that. What I was trying to do really was interpret the rice fields into almost like a flat piece of textile and contrasting that with the three-dimensionally modeled heads. These are examples of woodblock prints by the Edo period ukiyo-e masters Hiroshige and Hokusai. I've been a fan of these work since I was a kid, and as well as a whole host of other reasons. The work of these guys is one of the reasons I wanted to go to Japan in the first place. I mean, these guys are absolute geniuses at interpreting the visual world into shape and pattern, the things I've been talking about. I mean, quite simple shape and pattern, really, but incredibly sophisticated also. And you can really see why, you know, in the late 19th century, when European painters saw these for the first time, it really affected their painting. As you may know, painters like Van Gogh, Gauguin, Toulouse-Lautrec, Degas loved these prints. You know, whether they influence my work directly or not, I'm not entirely sure. You know, I think one never knows what one's influences are. It's kind of like a melting pot of different things. I would still stress that my influences are mainly still rooted in Western painting, really. But I mean, absolutely extraordinary works, these. This could now become a completely separate presentation where I could talk for a couple of hours about how pattern making and repetition, the things I've been talking about, are present throughout art history. I can't because I've got to stick to the subject of Japan. But, you know, if we look at the first images made by Homo sapiens, these are cave paintings made 10 to 20,000 years ago. It's kind of the same thing. It's pattern making and it's repetition of shape. And if you look at almost every period of art history, I'm not saying all images, that's not my proposal, but if you look at almost every period of art history, these things are present in it. And we're still doing the same thing today. So there's obviously something inherently pleasing and fascinating to the human eye about patterns and repetition. And again, if I was to give a separate presentation about this, I could also talk about how these things are present in poetry, in music, and architecture, and even clothing. And you know, we're pattern-making creatures, and we make sense of the world through patterns and through systems. You know, mathematics is filled with patterns, and sciences are filled with patterns and systems. So again, you know, I'm going down a different path here. I'll have to stop it and stick to Japan. The final section, thanks for your patience, is titled Memories of Japan. And this is because these paintings were made after leaving Japan and coming back to the UK. I've been back in the UK for about 9 years, so slightly less time than I was in Japan. Perhaps related to the thing I said at the beginning of the presentation, I was slightly wary about making paintings of Japan whilst being in the UK and being away from Japan. I think related to that thing, perhaps I said, I think about my feeling that of needing to be completely immersed in the place and not kind of pick up on kind of slightly lazy touristic tropes, which is difficult to do. But you know, I was a bit wary about doing so back in the UK, but you know, now that I look at them on the screen with you this evening, I doubt anyone would have guessed these were not made in Japan. So I feel like those 10 years in Japan, they sort of saturated into my DNA enough to hopefully still, to a certain extent, adequately respond to Japan. And I'm very grateful, you know, to the Daiwa Foundation and the MEX Scholarship that enabled me to be there so long and make this body of work. It's a great opportunity. But I should also mention I was asked to do some of these paintings. Some of these are commissions. This is commissioned by a Japanese art collector in Japan who collects work about the overhead motorways or highways that cut through the cities and lands and countryside. Bit of a strange interest to have, but anyway, there you go. I made him a painting of Nihonbashi, which is an area in central Tokyo, which has a huge motorway on these massive stilts cutting through it. And, you know, related to what I was talking about earlier, perhaps you can see again now how I'm interpreting the world as patterns rather than realism, really, whatever that means, you know. This was commissioned by a museum in Shizuoka whose work is dedicated to the woodblock prints of Hiroshige, who I showed examples I showed you earlier. And they asked me to paint a place that Hiroshige also painted depicted in one of his prints. It's a place called Miho no Matsubara in Shizuoka. And my paintings are also hung alongside Hiroshige's prints in the museum, which was a great honor for me and privilege, given that I've been a fan of that guy's work since I was a child, really. A gallery in Tokyo asked me who likes my black and white crowd paintings, they asked me to make one for them for a couple of art fairs in Japan. And this is based on Shinjuku, which was the first image we started from. The final paintings were not commissions, they were done for myself, really. And these were done during lockdown, and perhaps like lots of people during lockdown, you know, one tended to maybe reflect or remember more vividly. and this painting is based on day trips I made outside Tokyo to various villages and towns. And again, it's not based on one place, it's a kind of compression or crystallization of certain things I remember or find interesting into one image. The title of this painting is Night Carp. This could have actually slotted quite neatly into the section about old and new Japan. At the bottom, you have the koi, the Japanese carp fish, which have been depicted many times in traditional Japanese ink paintings and woodblock prints. And at the top, you have pachinko and love hotels, which I talked about earlier. This was a fairly recent painting. It was started during the second lockdown, and the title of this is Dragonflies and Rice Fields. It's based loosely around a memory of living in the middle of the rice fields whilst on the Daiwa scholarship and seeing these absolutely gigantic dragonflies. I mean, almost kind of Jurassic in their size. Certainly much bigger than you get in the UK. But also, again, perhaps like the Fireflies painting, trying to communicate a little bit of that, again, sort of magical feeling that you get when you encounter certain aspects of Japan. I'm hesitant to use the term because it's a very specific term related to certain writers and filmmakers and artists. For example, Garcia's 100 Years of Solitude. The term magic realism, so I don't really slot neatly into that category, but I think ignoring the terminology of it, I think those two words together, magic realism, they suggest something about what I'm trying to do with this painting and a couple of others. I also realized I hadn't done a winter scene when I was in Japan. I do remember I wanted to do one, I just didn't get around to it. And this is based on a trip to Tohoku in northern Japan during the winter and seeing everything blanketed in this beautiful, crisp, bright white snow. And that's that. That also neatly finishes off the seasons for me. Spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Again, big part of Japanese culture and depicted many times in traditional Japanese ink paintings and woodblock prints. This is a tiny little miniature painting painted on aluminium, on metal, which is a beautiful surface to work on, very smooth. Unsurprisingly, this is called origami. And I made the paper sculptures as preparation for the painting. Those are skills I learned from doing a couple of workshops in Japan. I thought I'd finish off with this. As you can hear, quite strange little painting. I'm not sure how I feel about this yet, but I don't do many self-portraits. I do have friends that do a lot of self-portraits, and their work is very much autobiographical. I don't feel like I'm that kind of artist at all. I think it's related to that thing I said at the beginning of the talk about a sense of otherness, of things that are very different to me, appealing to me. The title of this is Self-Portrait as a Balloon, brackets, Fear of Earthquakes, and it's based around memories of being in Japan during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the ensuing tsunami, and also a recurring dream I keep having about a tsunami. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. I'd like to thank you very much for coming again and for listening and for your interest in my work. I'm very grateful you came. Also, thanks to the Japan Society in London and for Swedenborg House for hosting this.
Thanks very much, Carl.
Okay.
That was really great. Great, thanks very much. I'm sure everyone has lots of questions. Please stay on and maybe chat to Carl personally and over a glass of sake. And thank you very much for Carl for giving us a fascinating talk. And thank you for coming tonight. And please stay and enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.